Greetings, brothers and sisters, this morning, and we're glad that many of you are live streaming from our church, from other local churches around the country and around the world. So we welcome you, and before we get started, I'd like to open in a word of prayer. Our God and our Father, we thank you for this time that we can learn. We thank you, God, that Jesus Christ is our great teacher. He's our mentor, and he's the one who we live to follow. God, we ask that by your Spirit, you teach us things about discipleship that we will be able to apply in this church and to the churches around the globe. May you be glorified and honored. And we thank you for who you are and what you've done for us in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. So this is actually our fifth Apologetics conference. Our first one was with Dr. Mark Farnham in Apologetics for the Church. And now we've done several with Norm Geisler International Ministries. This is our fourth NGIM conference. We've been trying to do them twice a year. And this has been a year since we've met up because of COVID. So we had to cancel our last one, but we're glad that we're able to meet up today. So I'm going to introduce my friend Thomas here. He is a missionary and an apologist for Norm Geisler International Ministries. He's the director of the Norm Geisler Institute, which helps train men and women who perhaps don't have the finances or the time to go to Bible college, and they might be working full-time, but they are able to get good training and mentorship in that program. He's also been pastoring, been involved in pastoral ministry for over 15 years as well. And he's also a professor and a director of the Apologetics department still, right? Yes, Department of Apologetics, directing that at the Carolina College of Biblical Studies in Fayetteville. So he's involved in ministry, and we're blessed to have you today, my friend Thomas. We're going to learn about discipleship and apologetics and how we can weave those together in the local church. Come up.
Well, thank you again for having me back in strange circumstances, and I'm going to be getting started up here as well. Pay no attention to the man on the screen over there. We adapt, we overcome as we try to meet again in these interesting times. So I'm setting up, there's some people who might want to be on Zoom, and I'm setting up Zoom here for anyone who might log in that way. And there we go. All right. So, yeah, 2 years ago, 2018, November 2018 was the first time that David Geisler and I came out here. We did conversational evangelism training, had a wonderful time doing that, and kind of tried to cast a vision in terms of how do we equip the church? How do we go about this? How do we help people share the faith, defend the faith, and multiply the faith? So we talked about conversational evangelism. I came back. We also talked about how to reach people and how to overcome some of those sour notes that, if you remember from conversational evangelism, we listen for sour notes that people sing, like they have conflicting beliefs, they have illogical beliefs. And I spend a lot of my time helping people as I teach in different schools, that they come and well, what do I do when people say this? What do I do when someone says this? And even when I'm teaching through the Institute, sometimes I'll just have parents who are saying, here's what my kids are saying. Here's the kinds of things they're saying. How do I answer this? So we spend some time giving an answer, and we recognize there's this blend between apologetics and evangelism. But one of the things David Geisler, in part of his vision with being an evangelist, is he recognized, because he's been doing it a lot longer than I have, and when he recognized that if we are not disciples ourselves, we're not going to evangelize. We have to be the kind of people who will evangelize. So my heart in the last, really, I was just mentioning, 1997 was my first experience in ministry. I rolled in as an acting youth director at my church in Memphis, Tennessee. And since the early 2000s, I've been focused on this question of how do we really make disciples? And these three components, these things that we've kind of brought in here specifically at Grace Baptist, but also what I try to teach to churches across the world, is if we want to evangelize, this is something that's necessary for a church. That there's very, very few churches, at least none that I've encountered. I've heard stories, but there's very few churches that, yeah, we don't need to evangelize. Everybody's like, yeah, we need to evangelize, we just don't know how. And evangelism is necessary, but it's insufficient by itself. And I just finished my doctorate at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Apologetics. I got to walk the stage. I was honored to walk the stage also with Anthony. I literally had to follow Anthony. Anthony got to walk first. So technically he graduated first. And so then I followed him, though, like not long after. And so I live in the apologetic world, and in the culture we live in, and especially as I know some of the interesting things that happen up here in New England, and many of the interesting things that are said and done, we know that apologetics is critical. It's necessary, but I would also say that as one who has a degree in apologetics, it's insufficient by itself. And so the Bible tells us we're supposed to make disciples. And there are churches and there's whole ministries that are focused on making disciples, but that's kind of like their only focus. They kind of like that tunnel vision. And I would say making disciples is necessary, but it's insufficient. So what we're going to talk about this morning, and what I want to present to you, this idea of this holistic approach that really blends apologetics, evangelism, and discipleship. And I call it diagnostic discipleship, because we toyed with the idea, like, what do we call this to communicate it? And it's started with conversational evangelism, but it's a little bit more than just a conversational discipleship. It is that, but it's more than that. And so what happens in churches, and I was sharing that I've been in several churches and ministered across several churches, mostly down the I-40 corridor from Memphis to the coast. So all down south, all these different churches, different church conferences, discipleship conferences. And that's why when it comes to discipleship, I ask people, is this discipleship? Is this what discipleship is? And usually I get the answer is, well, no, it's more than that. And I said, then why is it for most churches, when it comes to discipleship, something like this is all you're going to see? That when it comes to making of disciples, we end up turning it into a class. And I've been guilty of this myself. It's one of these that I recognize in churches when we have discipleship time or the discipleship hour. Down south, they actually call it training union. That was the name that it was called for so long. I don't know if that name ever was up here, but when I would go into some of the older churches, they would talk about the training union they used to have, and it was just basically discipleship. And it always revolves around some sort of class. And while this is necessary, it's not sufficient. That this isn't pure, this isn't really the whole picture of discipleship. And I teach at a Bible college locally. And even when I'm teaching at the Bible college, I tell them, I'm very limited in the actual amount of discipleship we're doing. We're in a class. I'm the professor. You are trying to get grades. This is not entirely discipleship. It's one component. But I said, don't be deceived to think that we're making disciple makers. We're targeting an aspect. And so that's why some of the ways with the Institute, we try to be more holistic in that. Because if all we do is teach people the information, and the mistake I made as an apologist many years ago, I was studying at SES. I served in youth ministry proper for about 15 years. So I basically helped raise up a whole generation. And I watched some of these teenagers that I had from 6th grade until they graduated. I would watch them, and they knew their stuff. They learned their lessons. They knew how to study their Bible. I taught them hermeneutics. They knew what that word was, and they knew how to do it. I taught them apologetics. I taught them doctrine. I taught them all these things. And what I recognized is when they graduated high school and they went to college, the one thing they didn't have was a heart that cared. They knew it, but they didn't care. And one thing that we know about people, and you should know this from your own self, is that what you really care about, you will do and you will pursue, and that is what will define you in many ways. I'd miss that aspect of discipleship. I'd miss that heart. I'd miss that character change. I'm even now discussing it in terms of quality of the soul. What kind, we look at people and we can see what skills they have. What can they do with their hands? We can take a look at their minds and talking with them and know the information and learn the information they know. But what is the quality of their soul? What kind of person they are? And that's when it comes to that discipleship component. And it's the hardest to develop. And so the general idea that's behind what we're doing today that we're going to kind of unpack, and tomorrow we're talking in Sunday school how we can go and approach this from a different direction. The sermon's going to integrate with this, and we even had a really creative idea for Sunday night that we're still toying with right now, that to kind of give a whole weekend of maybe shifting the thought process. So we can put it this way, that we know we're supposed to make disciples, and the reason these things integrate that we're talking about is apologetics comes along, and it's apologetics that bolsters our discipleship. That this is why I don't see apologetics as something separate, like, okay, in the church we're going to do apologetics, just like over here we're going to do evangelism, and over here we're going to do discipleship. There's a connection that we learn, and the reason I learned apologetics was to help me in my discipleship so that I could know and understand, but also so I could pass on to others. And this helps us in terms of diagnosing what's going wrong when we have wrong beliefs, when we have contradictions in our thinking. So many times in my Bible college, students will say something, and I'll point out that's a self-defeating statement. And it shocks them. And they'll tell me, this is what I've always believed. And I'm like, I'm not challenging that. I'm just challenging the fact that it's a self-defeating statement. I don't care how long you've believed it. It still defeats itself, that if it's true, it's false. And they kind of sit back and they're like, and they ask me usually I get two questions. They say, how did I not see that? And I said, well, that's something you're going to have to answer. And then they ask me, why has no one ever told me these things before? And that's because in our churches as a whole, we lack this unity in bringing these ideas together. So we know we're supposed to do discipleship, and we know we're supposed to do evangelism. And you've heard it if you've been at Grace before with some of these conferences. And I think you can even go back and look at some of the previous conferences we've done. We unite that apologetics with evangelism. When I was mentioning how I was in Nepal earlier this year, helping the church there, trying to figure out how do we reach this Hindu nation? How do we build bridges with Hindus? That was their number one concern. It's the only predominantly Hindu country in the world that, in terms of per capita, like it's their percentage. Well, that's a very different context. They also they asked me. They said, why don't Westerners answer our questions? It's like interesting. I was like, well, no one's really asking those kinds of questions over here, and that's why I love working with the Nepali, because they ask me questions like, when Jesus was resurrected, where did he get his clothes from? I love it. I'm just like, not thought of that before. Interesting. Okay. Even some of the pastors there, they said, the Bible's the word of God, but it also contains the words of Satan. How is this, teacher? And these are good questions, and these are the kinds of questions that the skeptical world wants to know. So apologetics is going to help us build head bridges, heart bridges. It's going to help us be more effective in our evangelism. And so as we do discipleship and we are changed and conformed to Christ, that's going to lead us to do evangelism. When we do evangelism, people are going to come to Christ. So then we've got to make disciples. And this process here of being disciples, making disciple makers, evangelizing, people coming to faith, this is the reproductive process of the church. This is what church is. Like it's one of those where I say it doesn't matter what church you are, what denomination you are, none of that is relevant. This is what every church should be about. It's going to look different in the different contexts in how it's done, but this is what churches should be about. And apologetics the whole time is undergirding that and bolstering that. And part of what we're going to do this weekend is I'm going to stop talking in terms of the church, and I'm going to start talking in terms of you, the individual believer. And this is usually where people get a little prickly, because it's easy to talk about what the church is doing, because when the church is doing something, I don't necessarily have to be involved. Like, it's coming up in the fall, which is deceptive today. Like, I come to Boston because I want Boston weather, and it feels like it does in North Carolina. I just want you to know that. Like, today is like the only day it's like hitting the 70s. Every other day, it's like I brought all of my winter clothes with me because I've been in shorts and t-shirts all week long. So deceptively warm. But fall is upon us, so especially down south, we start having these fall festivals. We start having, especially down south, you have to have hay rides. I don't know if you do hay rides here, and how that works. But I know down, pumpkin chunking contests, all those kinds of things, who makes the best casserole, everybody comes in, bobbing for apples. All of these things go on. And what I know is that as the church does things, I can choose, do I help? Do I not? If I do not participate in the fall festival, I do not need to go asking forgiveness of God, like, Lord, forgive me for not participating in the fall festival. When the church is doing things, we have options. The idea this weekend is that discipleship is a mandate given unto believers who form the church, and the church is a vehicle by which believers can make those disciples. The church should be helping the believers. It shouldn't be that the believers are going to church to help this church do things. This command was given to believers. And this is where again, it's almost like people say, well, that's for someone else to do. Someone else with some other gifting, some other equipping. The concept of making disciples is fundamental, I think, in a lot of ways to our nature, because what we're doing is with whatever we received, we're passing on to someone else. And we know there's right ways and wrong ways to do that. And that's why also when it comes to this concept of discipleship, I know this is true with children, because we were just chatting. My Grace Baptist got to be introduced to my children last year. I have 3 boys. And my oldest in particular, I'm focusing with him because he's taking in the most data. His little personality is changing and growing. And what I'm doing as a father is I've got 2 obligations. One I've already fulfilled. As a father, my obligation is to conceive a child and give him life, and I've successfully done that, and he's there. I've fulfilled that role. But now I've got to actually raise him. Now I actually have to pass on to him truth and goodness and these kinds of things. And so I know that in raising him, I have to be conscientious. I have to help train his mind. I have to give him certain skills. I make him come with me, okay, here's how we're going to clean a bathroom, and we're going to do this together. And we just moved recently, and so I gave the boys their own bathroom, and I said, you guys have to clean this. This is your bathroom. It was also a warning, because I also told them, this is the one you use, and this is the one you have to clean. So but I'm showing them, walking through. And to me, when you're raising children, in some ways, it's that discipleship process. I've got to diagnose what's going on. I got to know what to teach them. We have to talk about these things. And I'm going to draw a lot of connections with raising children, because that's fundamental to a lot of our natures. That for most of us who are parents, and by most I mean all parents recognize these issues that go into it. And a lot of parents, they tell me that sometimes when they have a kid, they're like, I was not ready for this. Others are like, we prepared, we were good, but we weren't ready for this. I think discipleship works the same way, in that for a lot of us in the church, we're just unprepared spiritual parents. And what happens if we share Christ, understand me, church, for all those who are listening, when we share Christ and somebody gets saved and we're shocked, that means that, that's the equivalent of kind of like when this couple all of a sudden one day find out, oops, we're going to have a baby. It's the exact equivalent. Oh no, we've been thrown into this. And I think the saddest thing for spiritual rebirth, when we're shocked, oh, hey, somebody actually came to Christ, we are not fulfilling our mission, our mandate as believers. We learn all this to pass this on. And I'll share also, my wife, much to her chagrin, the other night, the younger kids have gone to bed. My oldest now has his own room, so he gets to stay up a little bit later. And I was in a mood. I was in a a weird mood, and I was playing pickup sticks. He found this old pickup sticks game, and we were sitting there playing it, and I'm just messing with my wife, and she says something. I'm like, yeah, that's right. And so my 10-year-old goes, yeah, Mommy, that's right. And so my wife is watching my 10-year-old pick up my weird mannerisms. And my wife is like looking at my 10-year-old going, stop, don't do that. Don't be like your father. Like, quit doing those things. Like, that's what Daddy does. Stop it. And I'm not trying to pass these things on, but I am. And I think the same thing happens in churches, that as people come in, the churches, I've watched it internationally, where we have exported our church problems into other countries. When we're trying to make disciples, if a new believer comes into this place and they're going to be conformed to the image of Christ, and they only have these people in the pews to look at, what kind of person will they become in Christ Jesus? You see, you don't get to, it's like when you're a parent, you don't get to say, stop watching what I'm doing, you can't control that. They watch it, they absorb it. So the power behind that, and what I want to encourage, is that for those who feel like, hey, I can't make disciples, I can't do this, it's in some ways easier than you think it is. And that's what I really want to focus on with this morning. I'm going to understand a few terms, though, that we've mentioned before. Pre-evangelism, we've talked about this in using apologetics. This is tilling the soil of people's minds and heart to help them be more willing to hear the gospel. So this is where you're having those kinds of conversations with people because they don't know Christ, and you're trying to get them to come to Christ. You're looking for those connections. They say, well, all Christians are hypocrites. Or as I talked with a Muslim one time, and he says, I don't understand why you Christians believe that God could copulate with a woman and produce a child. And I said, well, that's not what we believe. Like, I don't believe that. That's easy. Don't believe that. He's like, what? Pre-evangelism. And when we do evangelism, this is, as David Geisler defines in his book, every day and in every way helping your non-believing friends take one step closer to the cross. Because if we can keep helping them, and again, in our conversations, we can conversate, like I began conversation this morning talking about fountain pens, okay? I like fountain pens. This is out of all of my advice. You have a fountain pen? Awesome. That's so much better. So this was my graduation fountain pen. This was my fancy pants fountain pen. And I get excited about it. I want to show people, like, this is like one of, like, there's only actually it was 1,999 of these were made. And I've got like it's like 1,200 or something. So I like my pen. I can talk about fountain pens. I can talk about, we talk about the things that interest us. And even sometimes somebody may not be that interested, like when it comes to fountain pens, but I don't really care. I'm like, I'm gonna make you interested in fountain pens. I'm gonna show you the beauty and why this fountain pen is so much better. And somebody says, well, what's wrong with my little, I just write with my 50-cent Bic pen. And I'm like, let me tell you the ways. Let me show you. Let me give you the experience, and I'll take out my pen. Give me some paper, and they bring out paper. No, give me good paper. Like all paper's not the same. So I show them, and we go through this whole process, and people are like, wow, I've actually made fountain pen converts at my Bible college. I'm not joking. I have students who have traveled the dark hole of fountain pens, and who now, when they take their notes, they're writing, and sometimes, they'll get sometimes they get a bad one, and I can recognize there's a malfunction. I can help them quickly, and overcome these issues. And I'm like, where's your backup? I don't have a backup. Oh, always have a backup. I have 3 in my backpack. So, there's this thing to it, and I get excited. You can tell I really like fountain pens. You might be like, that's weird. Do we get this excited again when it comes to Jesus and our walk with Jesus? That for a lot of people, they might look at us at first like, okay, that's weird, that's not my thing. But yet, through my excitement of the fountain pen, I've literally made converts. People who now only use fountain pens. They've experienced for themselves, they finally kind of looked at it. This is what we're doing when it comes to evangelism. It's okay for people to look at us and say, hey, that's weird. I don't think that way. I don't experience that. But what we do is we show them there's a reason we're so excited. And step by step, most of my fountain pen converts didn't happen overnight. Again, they were just like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pay that much for a pen, which they can get pretty pricey. I think we were actually, last time we were here in Boston, we were going by a shop downtown, and I was like, oh, look, a Mont Blanc, it's only $5,000. Now, I would never buy a $5,000 pen. That's worth more than my car. So I don't recommend people do that. And you're like, a $5,000 pen. So I show people, we walk step by step. Here's why you invest. Here's what you're doing. Here's why. That's kind of how evangelism works. And we're asking people, in one sense, to invest their lives in Jesus Christ. Why would somebody want to do that? We need to walk with people to show them why. So when it comes to discipleship, because when we've got people in the church or people come to Christ, we have to till the soil of hearts and minds to help believers bear fruit by living the truth. This is the connection. That in a lot of the skills, a lot of the things you're doing when you're doing evangelism, you can convert those right over into discipleship. And that's why there's so many churches that when I find people who are trained in evangelism, like, but I can't do discipleship. Like, it's the same thing. You can just convert these right over. Because as I'm trying to get in and figure out what's a person's worldview when they're a non-believer, I need to know, in terms of believers, what worldviews have they adopted or absorbed from the world? What are the kinds of things that have kind of infiltrated the church? And how do I, with gentleness and respect and love, deal with these ideas that are there? One way is, at my Bible college, the former receptionist, she once said, perception is reality. Like, we were talking about something, she says, perception is reality. Now, I have two basic options. I can say, that's stupid. Or I could say, going in a little nicer way, I could say, well, if I perceive that there's no God, does that mean that there's a God or that there's not a God? Which is it? Does my perception get to define reality? She sat and thought about it for a second. She says, why do so many believers say that? And I say, why do so many people make math mistakes? It seems a lot easier to get math right, but yet we make math mistakes. Well, when it comes to God, it's bad ideas that get passed on. We've never evaluated them. And I'm one of those who I think my primary passion right now is within the churches that we have. Are we willing to diagnose, to dive in, and to help the people who are in the pews? And I think in a lot of ways we need to start there, and that's going to be a big part of this morning. We have to start here, and I'm going to tell you why. Because as we seek to do discipleship, it's every day in every way helping your believing friends conform to the image of Christ. Every day in every way. And I emphasize every day. Because what churches like to do, and what churches are typically, with churches, all we can do is we have our discipleship hour. 1 hour a week. What I know about my sons is that if I only spend 1 hour with them a week in something, they're not going to learn that very well, whatever it is. Discipleship is much more, and that's why with the case of my children, as I'm raising my children, I have to look for all those moments, all those opportunities, all those teachable moments, which also means I have to be around them. I think that's the other problem we have in churches is that, fellowship is not a designated event in the church. Fellowship is a part of that community, that kind of relationship we should have. We should spend that time around each other. So the idea is basically this. What if there was a way to provide a core set of principles combined with specific and measurable goals to make disciple makers? And these principles unite the process of evangelism and apologetics to create a kind of discipleship that any believer can do. And this has been my burning question for the last 5 years. As a pastor, and for over a decade and a half, almost 2 decades now, I've been going to conferences asking, how do we make disciples? And the question the way I've framed it and the way I try to answer it was, what Bible study, what curriculum will help me make a disciple maker? So I go, and back when Lifeways roamed the earth, I would go to Lifeway, and it's like, oh, here's the new discipleship curriculum. Okay, let's do this. It's coming from a person at a really big church. Surely this should work. And we use it at our church. And even if everybody goes through it and like, wow, that was really nice, but no one's really changed. And I would look at this, and I'm like, maybe it wasn't the right one. Let me go spend some more money, throw some more money, go get another curriculum. And we do curriculum after study. Always good. I'm not knocking the fact that they're bad. They just weren't complete. And so I'm asking, what kind of core principles can we use? Can individuals use? And we also have to ask the question, what kind of disciple are we looking to make? What does it mean when discipleship is, when we're fully equipped? Because, again, Anthony just graduated. I just graduated. We know what it's like when we complete our requirements. That Anthony has taken his classes. Now, how much did he learn? What was his grade point average? I don't know. Okay, I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying, I don't know. Did he learn his lessons? Did he skate through? Did he do his work, get his good grade, and dump everything, and now he has a nice little piece of paper that's, the equivalent of a piece of toilet paper in terms of a degree? I don't know. I'm not saying he does. He's a good student. So I would assume he's learned his lessons, has brought all those to bear. And plus, I've had conversations with him. I know that he knows more than that piece of paper actually represents. So that's the other side. We know when graduates, they've jumped the hoops. But when it comes to making disciple makers in a church, do we even know what that benchmark looks like? Do we know what those basics are? And what we're going to be doing is we're thinking about what are those benchmarkers for a disciple maker. One of the first questions we're going to ask is, have we met those benchmarks? Do we have what we need in order to be disciple makers? I ask this again in terms of being parents. That I think in terms of being a parent, there's certain prerequisites. Like, as a parent, I have to know how to dress myself, so that way I can teach my children how to dress themselves. Correct? Because we all know, like, I've got a 3-year-old. I'm still, like, I'm trying my best. I really want him to learn how to dress himself, because I have to keep dressing him for himself. Like, I have to keep doing this. And he's also the kind of 3-year-old that as soon as his feet dangle in any way, he sits in any kind of chair, shoes come off. We're constantly losing shoes, and if shoes comes off when he's walking, he can't put it on. And I'm like, I really want to show you how. I really want him to learn how to dress himself. But if I didn't know how to dress myself, how could I show him? If I don't know how to cook, which I don't, how can I teach my children? What can I offer them? If I don't know how to do laundry, which I like to think I do, my wife will tell you otherwise. If I know how to do laundry, then I can show my children. I can pass these things on. When it comes to being a disciple of Christ, you've heard this phrase from me before, and we're going to unpack it more today. To put it in country speak, you can't give what you ain't got. We have to disciple from a place of having been changed by Christ. So that's going to be the first aspect of this. So the principles that we're going to lay out to get to the core of what we're doing today is I've thought through this because I've seen all of these discipleship models. I follow the gurus, and they have all of these specifics. Do this thing, do this thing, do this thing, do this thing. And I would go and I would do that thing, and I would not get that result. But the same thing happened with parenting books. That if any of you have ever gone to the parenting books and they say, oh, you have this problem with your child, do this exact thing. And you go and you do that exact thing, and now it's worse than it was before. And you wish you had not done that thing that they told you to do, because that thing had the complete opposite effect, because your child was not the kind of child that they experimented on to find out that kind of thing. And I use that word. They experimented, and they're like, oh, look, here, do these things. It didn't work, because it just always happens that way, that your kid is not the normal. Like, it's outside that realm, functions differently. I think discipleship works the same way, because I go into church after church after church, and I'm like, the things that the experts are doing, it just doesn't seem to work at this church, because they're so different. And I've been at some churches, and I always like to say, I go to this church, and they're different. But every church is that way. You are that way because you are the only you that's you. There are no other yous running around. And as a church comes together, and we're going to make disciples, we have to focus on the individual. Like, I want to make that person a disciple. Or you might say, hey, I need to be a disciple. So what are those principles that are going to guide, that we can contextualize, that we can bring into our lives? And it's going to be pretty easy to remember. I made this little this guide, and it's follow, because when it comes to discipleship, we want to follow Jesus. So these 6, and I call them principles, because just like when it comes to evangelism, we want to follow some principles, because you come to an unbeliever and they just don't fit categories, or they're asking weird questions, or they have this mishmash of beliefs, and it's like this is not textbook in any way. So these principles are going to guide us. The first that I tell people, if you're going to do diagnostic discipleship, if you're going to make disciple makers and combine all this, the first thing you do, you focus on being a certain kind. And this is where another way of phrasing this that you'll see is that you focus on being before doing. It's another way of putting it. And a certain kind is reference to a particular book that talks about these kinds of ideas. We want to be a certain kind, and the way we do this, we focus on being before doing. So, and I use this analogy when it comes to, when it comes to the parent and raising children, and I say, look, every believer has the potential to be a disciple maker. And this is the radical statement. This is the radical idea, because if I go into a church, every believer has the potential to be a disciple maker. Most people, like, yeah, but not me. No, everybody has the potential. Yeah, but not me. No, everybody has the potential. And I have to have these kinds of conversations. And you mean like, well, you mean the church? Every church can make disciples. I'm like, no, believers make disciple makers. The church provides the support for that to happen. And I look in the eyes of believers who I can see in their eyes. They're saying, their eyes are telling me, not me. I'm like, no, it's a you. It's a you. It's really a you. And I go in and I talk, and I talk everyone from the great-great-grandparents all the way down to the youth and new believers. Like, everybody has this potential, because one of the things I've learned in a church body is that, with me, I just turned 40. I tend to interact and relate to middle-aged men and women who have kids later in life, because my kids are 10, 6, and 3. So when I get around people who are kind of fit my profile, we're in that same place. We connect a lot faster than I do with somebody who might be, like I said, 80 years old and has like great-great-grandkids. You got great, just great. You might have some great ones. I don't know. If any of you have great-great-grandkids, that's pretty amazing. But we see that there are people who can connect with others far better than I can. And even when it comes to teenagers, I knew this as a youth pastor. I'm not a sports person. I've never claimed to be a sports person. So all the sporty, athletic boys, they found unity in harassing me with my lack of sports knowledge. And that was one of the ways we built relationships, was through our differences. But for those guys who come in and who had played sports and who had done that, instant connection, you see it. I see it all the time at being in Fayetteville, large military town, a lot of vets, retired veterans. And when vets get together, it's instant connection. They've met each other for the first time, but there's that unity that they have. So when I say that every believer can be a potential disciple maker, do I believe you can go out and make disciples of the whole world? That's not what I'm saying today. But I'm saying that in your sphere, you can make disciple makers. And people think, well, I couldn't possibly make that many. My wife and I produced 3 children. In terms of continuing the human race, we've done our job. I replaced myself, I replaced my wife, and we have 1 more. That's how the human population increases, is it not? You have to replace more than what you would eventually lose. All I have is 3. And so I would say when God said, be fruitful and multiply, that's what my wife and I did. We don't have to have 20 kids in order to be a real family, or you don't even have multiple kids in order to be a real parent. That for a lot of parents who have 1 child, you're still a parent. Even for parents who adopt children, all their children are adopted, they're still real parents in that sense of the job that they've taken on. They may not have, it's just like in the church, that if somebody comes in the church and they've already been saved, you may not have been the one who brought them in the kingdom, but now they are among you, and you get to adopt them. You get to pass on what has been given to you. But we have to focus on being that beforehand, because transformation must precede multiplication. I know my wife and I, we made the decision not to have children until I finished my master's, until we kind of got in a place where we could have children, she could stay home. And the unintended consequence of that I really appreciate is that when my wife and I were married, we got married, I was 20, she was 19. So we were still kids ourselves. So we didn't have our first child until 2010, so it was 10 years later. Now I'm 30, and my wife is 29. Now we're having kids, and a lot of people, a lot of her friends got married, had kids right out of high school, and we looked at this, but I said, in our 20s, we were not ready to be parents. We had to figure out, I think we were still figuring out how to be like normal, well-adjusted human beings. We weren't ready. So part of the call of discipleship is getting you ready, you being that kind of person who has something to pass on. You have to be transformed. And what happens in our churches or what happens in our ministries, we mistake busyness for productivity. We think that just because we're so involved in church that we are being productive. And that's when I look at families, and I see some families that are so busy and running around everywhere. And I've had this conversation as a youth pastor. I would ask parents, I said, how are you raising your kids? And they would, well, we've got them in this sport, they do this, and and we go on this family vacation, and we do these things. And I was like, yeah, but how are you raising your kids? And they don't understand what I'm asking. How are you transferring what you are as an adult to your young, influential child? How are you specifically doing that? And they've mistaken being a busy family for being one that's raising their children. And I said, these children, they're absorbing from somewhere. If it's not from you, who's raising your children? And we don't think about that. So when it comes to churches, if the people in the pews aren't making disciples, who's discipling the people then? Who is growing them? Who is conforming them into what image? Because we're all changing. We're all growing up in that sense. We're all on a spiritual journey. Who's guiding that and how? For a lot of people, I see it's TV, Disney. Those are terrible. They're terrible parents. They're terrible disciple makers too. So our need as believers demand that we focus on the redemptive work of Christ in our lives first. So I tell people, I think this is why if you feel incompetent as a discipler, part of the reason is because you've not been a disciple. This is why even as when I got married, and again, the whole thought of having kids terrified me, and that's because I hadn't really grown up yet. My wife might say that I haven't completely grown up yet, as it is, but I know that I knew early on I was not ready. I was still, in many ways, and my wife would agree, and I'm not joking, I was selfish, I was self-centered. I spent those early years just figuring out how to be an adult. And then that's when we were like, now we're ready to have kids, not because of the economics, but I realized now I can actually raise a child. So in this case, doing before being. So if we try to make disciples before we are disciples, it's going to corrupt the process. What are you passing on? What are you giving to your children? And I know, like, even from my family growing up, I had two older brothers, and my two older brothers tried to disciple me. They would tell me what was good and what was bad, and it's often what I learned later in life is just to take whatever they said and reverse it, and I was okay, because my brothers gave me terrible advice. Terribly, like, oh, here's I can't even mention the things that they told me and the kind of advice they gave me. It's bad. And these are the kinds of things I'm like, this just doesn't sound right. Like I was cognizant enough to say, I don't think this is normal human interaction and operation. So my brothers, again, as they try to pass on their wisdom to me, I understood that there was a greater wisdom out there. I just didn't know what it was. And I sought that. So in the church, if we're trying to make disciples and we're saying, follow me and watch what I'm doing, if we're not living in Christ, we don't have the kinds of things to pass on. And what I tell people is, I say, when it comes to being a disciple, to be a disciple maker, if you are living as a disciple, part of that is just bringing somebody along and just having them watch you and having them pick up those things from you. My children pick up my speech patterns. They pick up my wording. They pick up my figures of speech. They learn their words from me. I was mentioning the other day about euphemisms, and my son is like, what's a euphemism? And we would be talking, and I would give like some sort of metaphor. He's like, is that a euphemism? I was like, that's not a euphemism. And he's trying to figure this out, and they see the things that I do, and they will end up doing those same things. And I'm like, this is what making disciples is all about. The connection between raising children and raising disciple makers, it's so interconnected. And that's why I tell people, you can do this. You can play that part. So to take some practical steps, one of the ways, and we have this as one of our tools, is I call it take a soil sample from Matthew 13. Is your soil hard? Do you understand the things of Christ? Do you have fear? Do you have rocks that, when the persecution comes, do you fall away? Or do you have the thorns? Do you have things in your life that pull you away, that pull your heart? This is where you have to evaluate yourself, because this is what I did as a parent. I evaluate myself. Am I the kind of person that I want my son to grow up to be? That's an interesting question for parents and grandparents. Are you the kind of grandparent that if your grandchild was to become just like you, would you feel pride or shame? That's a very, very real question many of us have to ask. And I try to tell parents and grandparents, if the answer is shame, it's not too late to turn that around. You can still do good with the time you have left. And I tell people in churches, you still have plenty of time to be that disciple who can pass on to others. One of the other ways that in some of the practical steps, my pastor just preached through the Beatitudes. And David Geisler, I believe he called the Beatitudes, it's the DNA of a soldier of the cross. That these Beatitudes, these are the kinds of things that you have to sit and almost kind of think about. Like when it comes to poor in spirit, we look at, okay, I need to be poor in spirit. What does that mean? What does that look like in your life? And these things, these are qualities of soul. Like you can't, like I can be poor financially. That's super easy. Like, I mean, that's the easy thing to be. And even if you have money, it's easy to be poor because you just ditch your money and voila, you're poor. Poor in spirit is a condition. And when you recognize that you're poor in spirit, that will change how you operate. When it comes to those who mourn over their sin, those who are truly meek of heart, not just act that way, because see, I can act humble, I can act meek, I can act merciful, but I may not actually feel any mercy. I've had to do this with my own children sometimes, that I know, like when my child hurts himself because he's disobeying, I have a really hard time experiencing mercy at that point in time. Like my child is hurting, and I'm the kind of great dad who I'm like, oh, serves you right. You'll learn. My wife is like, bring some mercy into that. Bring, some love and tender and those things in there. I'm like, okay, so I take my kid and I'm, pat his head. He'll be okay. It'll grow back. Whatever happened. And I can demonstrate it, but actually having that. That's where I have to spend my time with Jesus, and I have to say, Lord, I need mercy in my heart, and I don't know how to get it there. I need mercy for my heart. There are plenty of cases where I am merciful and my heart breaks, but I've also recognized where I have a hard heart. I'm like, Lord, I need to be different. I need that inward change. I need to be one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Because when you find somebody who really wants something and you're around them, it almost compels you to want what they want. It ends up transferring, like, yeah, like when if you go out to eat, everybody's like, oh, of course, we'll go with steak. Everybody's wanting steak. Now, maybe steak's not your favorite thing, but everybody's just all gung-ho. Peer pressure, well, call it whatever you want. I've seen people like, okay, fine, me too. That's actually a lot of the ways I got my kids to actually eat more than macaroni and cheese. I would just be like, man, this is so good. And they would try whatever I had. Yeah, you're right, Daddy, this is so good. And we did that the other day with pickles. My wife loves pickles. And this was just Thursday night, and we were eating hamburgers, love pickles. My 3-year-old's like, I want a pickle too. They're so good. So we gave him a pickle. And he eats it. He's like, And he just has this look on his face, and you can tell he's trying so hard to like the pickle. But he doesn't like the pickle. But that's the influence we have as parents. That's the kind of influence we should have as disciplers, being the merciful, pure in heart. And what's so difficult about most of these Beatitudes is you just can't go out and do them and say you are that thing. How do you go out and do pure in heart? God is the purifier of hearts. And that's why when we live as disciples, He purifies us. And we can live our lives and share our lives from a place of being pure in heart. This is where we would start. So we focus on that being before doing. Focus on being a certain kind. We've got to start there. So this is my call to churches, and it's the radical call. It's almost like if you have a discipleship program and no one's actually like a disciple of Christ, it's the kind of thing that I would say, don't invite people outside the church to that. And that shocks churches. I'm like, that's okay to have things to say, you know what? We as a church need to bunker down and deal with this, so that way we can share that with other people. But I think the mentality that happens in churches, we got to get lots of people. If we don't have lots of people, it's not a success. And for those of you who are out in internet land watching this, I got 5 people in front of me right here. Now, I don't know how many are on the internet, but also there's a stance for me where I don't care. That's not my issue. That's not the sign of success. It's not about the numbers, because when we have quality, quantity will follow. But you know good and well that just because you have quantity will not lead to a necessary greater quality. We need to focus on the quality of the people who are in a church. Your quality. What is your quality of soul? What is your quality of a relationship with Christ? What is that right now in your life? And no one is beyond the place, I've passed that. No, you haven't. As we focus on being before doing, we will become the kind of people that, for me, I've often used the illustration, and I scoffed at it at first, that my wife, whenever she was doing dishes, I was like, you want me to do dishes? And she's like, no, I want you to want to do dishes. And the wisdom of her words is that, because I was like, well, I can't do that. I can do the dishes. I can fulfill my duty, and I can do it with a smile and attitude, but I hate dishes. What happened, though, is I became the kind of person, the quality of my soul changed, that I stopped being so selfish, that I saw this as an act of love. And from my love and my relationship with my wife, I want to serve her, and the dishes is a way to do that. And so even in my own life, even in my grand 40 years, there's these times my wife looks at me and she's like, who are you? And that's honestly, it's a snide remark, but I love when she says it, because that's how I know I'm becoming different. That's how I can recognize I'm conforming more to the image of Christ. To my shame, she's never seen it before. But to the glory of Christ, I'm now manifesting that from a changed heart. So even in my relationship with my wife, my kids, I'm focused there first, because if I can't be nice and disciple them, what right do I have to disciple anybody else? If I can't begin there, start with the home, start close to home, and it should radiate outwards. So we focus on this being before doing. When we do that, we become this. Then we're in a place to kind of observe behavior of other people. We can see what's going on. With my children, I can look at them and I can see, I tell my wife all the time, my children are doing something, I said, that's my fault. She's like, you taught them how to do that? I was like, no, actually I didn't teach them how to do that. That's genetic. That was me when I was their age. That is just them being, that is the curse of the father delivered unto the children. They have my depravity. I can see it. There's other times they do something and my wife says, where did that come from? I said, that's your side of the family. That's them. that was your contribution. We pass on these things, but we can observe their behavior and we can see, I understand where that comes from because I used to be that way. I can observe and I can see, I know where that's coming from. And so from a place of compassion, I can address that because in the case like with my children, I am the guy who's removed the plank from my eye. I see the speck in my child's eye, and I know why that's a dangerous thing. I know what that leads to. And I can deal with that speck. I can deal with that splinter before it grows into the plank. So this is when it comes to discipleship. This is why I say, with your testimony, the things in your life, you're in a unique place. My wife grew up in church. She can communicate with people who've grown up in church far better than I can because I didn't grow up in church as a child. I'm more of a convert. So my whole experience is different. My family experience is different. I'm coming from a very different place than her. And so there's value in the body of Christ when you say, well, I just come from this simple background, no flair, none of these things. There are people who will relate to you far better than the person who in a blinding blaze of glory was saved by God, because there's a lot of people that they don't share that kind of experience. They're like, I don't understand that. But for the people who have experiences they do understand, God has given you a bond with them. There's a connection immediately. So as we seek to observe behavior, one of the things I also encourage in churches, jump for relationship, not to conclusions. So I always have to specify this quickly, is that we want to be able to connect with people, and we need to be able to look and see these things, and we observe things like their worldview. We observe their doctrine, their virtues and vices, their values, the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives. We do this because the same thing I do with my children, when I observe and I see these kinds of things that are happening, I can deal with it. I can come in and say, good job. My 6-year-old, the other day, I think I actually have it right here. I have one of these. So this is the D-ring. This is not the D-ring that went where everything went down, but it was a D-ring that was almost identical to this. And my 3-year-old, he wanted the D-ring, and that my 6-year-old had, my 6-year-old wanted his own D-ring, because I use this to clip my keys and all that. My 6-year-old's like, I want a D-ring just like Daddy. That discipleship process, always seeing Daddy with the thing, wants it. My 3-year-old now wants the D-ring just because his brother has it, because that's my little hedonist 3-year-old. And my 6-year-old goes, it's okay, Ezra, you can have it. I'll just get it back from you later. Now, if you don't know my 6-year-old, that was like one of the most massive wins of personal character development we've seen in that child. Like I even told my wife, like I even sent her a voice message. Like I want to tell you what Levi did, and she replied back, she's like, happy cry. Major win. We observe their behavior, and I've observed this selfishness in my 6-year-old because it was my selfishness. I know it. And I'm watching and seeing him develop. And so real quick, before we go to break, ways that we can do this. Spend time with people in small groups. Spend time with them. Get to know them. Get a sense, an intuitive sense. Talk to them about what is important to them. This is discipleship. Talking to people about what's important to them, that's discipleship. And you're just like, well, that's just being neighborly. Like, exactly. This is why everybody can be disciple makers. It doesn't take like surgical skill to do this. Cautiously engage in controversial issues to see how they respond. Not that we don't have enough controversial issues in this world to pick from. I think that there's plenty that we can kind of gauge, see where they stand, what they think, talk about Scripture to gauge that level of spiritual depth. Again, this doesn't require a seminary degree. This doesn't require knowing the Bible cover to cover. This just requires intentionality. Being intentional you can be that disciple maker. So at this point, it's 10:30. We're going to take a break, give you a chance to move around. Those who are out in internet land will be coming back at 10:45, and turn it over to Anthony.
Yes, just briefly, you have the link in the description of the YouTube video that you're watching, and if you're on Facebook, another video will pop up probably around 10:40, and then we'll start the session at 10:45, so you can refresh that page. It'll be on there. So we'll see you then.